Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the new year. It is 2021. After the annus horribilis that was 2020, it's time for a new year, and we're off to an interesting start. Especially when you look at what's going on in politics. I am not going to talk politics at all. The only thing I will say is, guys, be safe. Watch yourselves out there and make sure you survive all the crazy stuff that is going on. And it's not just in the US, as you obviously understand that I am referring to. It's all over the place. And politics is crazy now. It's just nuts. It's always been a little bit off, obviously, because it's politics, but it's gotten a whole lot worse in the last few years, and these last few weeks have been even worse. So tensions are high. Everybody's on edge. A lot of people are really angry from all sides. Doesn't matter which side you're on. So I would say that, maybe try to ratchet things down a little bit. Try to take a step back and get some perspective before you launch yourself into something that is basically a collision course that ends with violence and a lot of other things that you really don't want for your life, nor for your loved ones. Now, that said, everybody needs to make their own decisions as to what is important for them. So I'm not the one to judge, but I will say, be safe. Try to live your life and try to make sure you are safe from harm and that you do not harm others. I think that's the best possible message that I can give. And I'll leave it at that. Right, so I'm going to get into the main part of this episode in a little bit about martial arts and self-defense training for the older and elderly. But first, some general updates. I mentioned it in the last episode that I would be doing a little bit more stuff online. And I've actually just finished writing and making a blog post for tomorrow. That's when it comes out. And that is a video that I made on how to fill a heavy bag the wrong way and the right way. And this is like the number one question that I get on one of my videos that I put online many years ago. And that's how to refill a heavy bag without emptying it first. And what I'm planning on doing is basically put more stuff on my YouTube channel, because I've been ignoring it a little bit. Well, not ignoring, just that there's just so much stuff that I'm doing online right now and so much content that I'm creating each month that something had to give. And in many regards, the YouTube channel was put on a back burner a little bit. I'm trying to rectify that now. So what I will do is relatively short segments, anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes, maybe even a little bit less, in which I answer comments that I get on my YouTube videos. So if you have questions about some of the stuff there, leave a comment. I'll eventually see it, and maybe I will be able to answer your question. Make no promises to answer everything, obviously, but it's something that I enjoy doing, and it's also a lot easier for me to sometimes make such a video because I can go a little bit more in depth, and then if the question comes up again, I can point people to the video like, here's your answer. So everybody wins. And that's what the first video is about. It's on that refilling a heavy bag video that I made years ago. That's a question I got a lot, and I also got it outside of YouTube, obviously. Like, what do you put in a heavy bag? Well, I gave an answer to that, and then also wrote a blog post about it, and that goes live tomorrow. So hope you guys can enjoy that, and I plan on doing a lot more of that in the future. Just put out more stuff on my YouTube channel and so on. So that's the first update. Second update is I've been training more again, so I'm feeling pretty good right now. Obviously, within the limitations of my age bracket and injury status and so on. And that's kind of what this video is about. This podcast episode is about. And my goal is to, for this year, do a lot more training than I did last year. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do so because of the pandemic and very limited, not being able to teach my classes and not being able to go pretty much anywhere to train myself. So looking forward to eventually getting back to that, and hopefully that will allow me to work with my students again, which means that I can make videos with them. That's been a real difficult part of creating anything online, especially on my Patreon this last, well, not last year, but since March of last year when the lockdown started here in my country. It was just difficult to get a partner to even make a photo, just make a picture for an article or a book or whatever. It was hardly possible because we weren't allowed to get together. So with a little bit of luck, here in Belgium, the vaccinations are supposedly going to be finished by September. So it looks like, if all goes well, 2021 is going to be a transitional year. And then eventually things will get to something that maybe resembles normal by the end of the year. We'll see. But with a little bit of luck, I can then just do a bunch more stuff that I was very limited in doing. So that's something that I am looking forward to as well, and hope that I can pull that off as quickly as possible. And then you guys get to see new content, obviously. Next for the podcast, I've tried to reach out to a bunch of people that I would like to invite as guests. I haven't been able to do so for a variety of reasons in the last few months. So getting back to that, hopefully everybody says yes. There are a few really big names, but I said, you know what? Sure, you're a big famous guy, but I've got nothing to lose, so I'll just contact you. And the worst thing is that I either A, get no response, or B, they say no. So we'll see how that goes. And you guys will obviously be the first to know if anybody says yes, and then you'll hear about it. So that's pretty much it for the updates. And then I want to get to the main part of this podcast. And for this episode, it was a question from Brian Inwards. And Brian is actually a new patron of mine. And he asked me this question on my Facebook page a while ago, where I asked for ideas for articles and podcast episodes and so on. So before I go on, so shout out to Brian, obviously. You get the shout out for this episode, Brian. So everybody, you want to hit me up on Patreon, links in the show notes, patreon.com/Wim Demeere, my name. And we're entering year 5 in a few weeks of being on Patreon. Got a huge catalog of information and videos and articles and stuff in the archives there. So guys, check that out. But thank you, Brian, for being a patron and for your question. And here goes. That was his question. The old are probably some of the most vulnerable, as less physically fit, strong, yet a lot of training ignores their needs. Your ideas on this, please. So I kind of jumbled up that sentence. Sorry, Brian. So the old are probably some of the most vulnerable, as less physically fit and strong, yet a lot of training ignores their needs. And he's asking for my ideas on this. Well, I've got a bunch of them. Before I go on, I am closing in on 49 myself. So the big 50 is not that far away anymore. I am not an unwritten page, as we like to say over here, meaning that I've stacked up a fair amount of injuries and physical issues over the year because I trained like a maniac when I was younger. So this is a topic close to my heart. I've got a bunch of things that I want to share. And the first thing that I want to say is that age doesn't mean you have to give up. Age doesn't mean that that's it, you're done, and you can't do anything anymore. There are numerous examples that I could give you of elderly people in their 60s, 70s, 80s that fought back when it came to being attacked or aggression or being burglars or some pickpocket trying to violently steal their money, whatever. There's tons of articles that I could link to. And this includes women, by the way, not just older men, but also women who effectively fight back. And I'm not going to do that. You know what I'm talking about. I'm going to point to one thing, and that's my dear friend Lauren W. Christensen. Go check out his Facebook page. He's, I'm sorry, Lauren, getting up there in years. I'll be with you soon. But meaning that he's not the youngest anymore, but look at all the things that he can do. There's nothing wrong with his speed and power. Quite on the contrary, a lot of folks, a lot younger than Lauren is right now, they are put to shame when you look at the speed and power and technique that he still has to this day. So I'll put it that way. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of any of his techniques. And I'm guessing you wouldn't either. So the reason I bring that up is if you look at Lauren as an example of what is possible, then I think that should give you hope and inspiration to train. And that's kind of the main message of what I will talk about today, is that you have to do the work. Because you're old doesn't mean that you have to give up, doesn't mean that it's impossible to train or defend yourself. It only means you have to act accordingly. So that is the first part. Now, I will talk about several different aspects of what I think is important for training as you get older. They're different topics, so I'm going to go at first a little bit into prevention and so on, and then get to the physical part. And then also a little bit about tactics and some other considerations. So let's start with the first one, lifestyle. If you're getting up there in years and you are still getting involved in bar fights or hanging out in rough neighborhoods when you really don't have to, you might want to check yourself and maybe think about why the hell are you doing these kind of things? Because what is the upside at that point in your life of still running all those risks? That's something you have to consider now. Obviously, not everybody is in a situation in which they can easily avoid that. Let's say that you live in a bad neighborhood and you don't really have the option to move for whatever reason. That is perfectly valid. But if that's not the case, if that's not you, then maybe you should try to avoid putting yourself at risk to begin with. And this is the cornerstone of any effective self-defense training schedule or program or mindset, if you will, is that you try to avoid the fight if you can. And if you can't avoid it, try to get away when the situation develops. And if you can't avoid that, if the situation actually starts and it gets to violence, that you do one thing or whatever you need to do to get away. Anything to avoid standing toe-to-toe with somebody and duking it out and ending up in a dueling situation. Because that is one of the key points I'll mention also when we get to the physical training part, is that if you're in your 70s, you won't be able to keep up with a guy in his 20s. It's not going to happen. No matter how great a shape you're in, and unless he's like the worst possible specimen of physical fitness and you are the absolute best one in your age bracket in the world, sure. But we don't train for those kind of exceptions. So let's look at the averages, and you don't want to be in a position where you have to fight and stay toe-to-toe with any attacker. That is not your goal. On the contrary, what you want to do is just get out of there. Make sure you can get away as quickly as possible to get back to your life and enjoy it as much as you can. And the reason is simple. Even if you win, even if you do end up punching that guy or whatever technique you do, you might end up getting injured. Now, as we get older, our bodies become more fragile and injuries become permanent. If you are in your 70s or 80s, even younger, and you break a bone, you break a hip as you fall, you tear some muscles in your shoulder or whatever, there's a high likelihood that will be a permanent injury. The result of that is that it will drastically reduce the quality of your life. And it's a really bad way to end your life, by basically becoming a crippled or being unable to continue doing the things you love to do. Even if it's just going for walks because you fell on your hip and as you were fighting with that guy and you broke it and there was surgery involved, and it's a year-long process to rehab, and there was something going wrong and you never really recover, and now you're limping. And all of a sudden, all those lovely walks you like to do, they're gone. So it's a little bit of a silly example maybe, but the point is valid in my opinion. And that if you can avoid those kind of risks, I mean, who wants to be a cripple for the rest of his life when you get at that stage? Nobody. Now, age is the ultimate thief. Age takes away everything. That is true, but you don't have to help it along. You don't have to make it easier for old age to creep up on you and basically take all the joy out of your life. So that is a key part, in my opinion, is avoid risks. And it's easy to become a grumpy old man, and I know because I am one. It's easy to let yourself go and start, yelling at the kids to get off your lawn. And by that, I also mean getting into confrontations where you can actually avoid it, thinking that your age protects you. It's not always true. In some cultures, that is more prevalent, but in others, you might be very disappointed when you discover that somebody has absolutely no reservations to punch you in the face just because you're older and you feel you have more authority over young people. So avoid those kind of things. That's the first one. Next, mindset. You have to understand and accept that your age makes you an easier target due to the physical deterioration. And like I mentioned, we lose strength, we lose speed and so on. We lose a lot of things eventually, but that doesn't mean you can't do anything, but it is a fact that this happens. You can't ignore it. And everybody who has bad intentions knows that. If they can choose between you and a big, strong, very muscular guy who looks like he works out all the time and is in great shape, who do you think they're going to pick? So as the years pass, more and more criminals will see you as a mark. Accept that. Just accept that as a fact and then act accordingly. And that brings me immediately to the, in my opinion, most important part, and that's prevention. Awareness and avoidance. Being aware of your surroundings and avoiding any trouble that you can see coming. Now, as we get older, our cognitive functions also tend to decline, but it doesn't mean you have to have your head in the clouds all the time. This is a part of the aging process, the fact that our brains kind of lose their incredible powers that we were used to having, that you can think quickly and that you can analyze everything in an instant and so on. Well, you should accept that you might not be as sharp as you used to be, but that is no reason to accept that. Well, that's it. I cannot be aware anymore. I'm deaf and blind, so I can't do anything. No, that's not what it means. What it means is that you have to work harder and accept your limitations. Meaning that as you go outside and you go into the public, that you are aware that you're probably a target for certain criminals, and that you spend a little bit more effort on making sure that they cannot catch you. Basically, they cannot catch you napping, and all of a sudden they can come at you, and you didn't see any warning signs at all. Same thing when it comes to avoidance. As soon as you spot something, take action. If you hesitate, if you're not sure, take action. Err on the side of safety and try to avoid whatever potential problem you spot. And, if it turns out to be nothing, that's fine. But if it was actually something, you actually avoided it. So that doesn't mean you have to become paranoid, as always. There's no need for that. It does mean that you have to be very realistic when it comes to the victim profile that you are becoming for certain kinds of criminals and people with really bad intentions. So be aware of that and try to focus as much as you can on avoiding any potential problem. And it's going to go a long, long way. Now, this is advice that is valid for everybody regardless of age, but I believe that as you get older, you might want to pay more attention to that. That said, let's look at what I think maybe Brian was talking about when he asked me that question, and that is the physical part. Now, as I mentioned before, we will get more and more physical limitations with age. The whole point is that you work around them. In particular, men, we lose muscle mass relatively quickly as we get older. For women, osteoporosis, it's a really dirty word, but you have to understand that it applies to you very much. So that is your bone density going down, which means that if your bones break, they will break easier, and it will be a pretty bad break. So you want to make sure that you understand that this is a risk, and as much as possible, you try to work around those kind of limitations. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to try and optimize whatever you've got left, taking into account whatever injuries or other physical problems that you have. But I am a very strong believer in strength training. Strength is the basis for many of the things that you will be wanting to do as you get older, even if it's just walking up the stairs. If you lack the strength in your muscles to do so, you won't be able to do it. So let alone defend yourself. So some sort of strength training, it doesn't have to be lifting heavy weights or doing Olympic lifting, not at all. If that's what you do, fine. I would just suggest that you focus mainly on technique as opposed to lifting extremely heavy weights. And again, injury prevention. But the main thing is that you do something to maintain your strength as much as you can. If you don't, well, you'll probably end up regretting it, because there's a threshold that if you pass it, when it comes to losing physical strength, and by that I mean muscular strength, is that all of a sudden a lot of things become a lot harder, which means that you don't do them anymore, which means you lose even more strength, and after a while they become impossible. Again, like I mentioned walking up a few flights of stairs. Well, you lack strength, it becomes difficult, you don't do it anymore, you lose more strength, and then you can't anymore. So what would I recommend? Well, join a gym if that's what you like to do. If you've got equipment at home, use it. Dumbbells, barbells, doesn't have to be anything fancy. You have fancy equipment, that's fine, but just do strength training. What you need to do at least twice a week with a day or two between each training session. Make sure that you hit all the big muscle groups and the smaller ones, of course, but all the big muscle groups, and try to maintain your strength as best as you can. You don't have any equipment. Over the first pandemic, I made a video for resistance band training for martial artists, and I'll put a link in the show notes. You can find those at wimsblog.com/56, so 56 the number, and that's the link with all the show notes that I will mention. All the things that I mentioned here, I'll put a link in on that page. So resistance bands are very cheap, and you have a lot of versatility that they offer. You can do so many training exercises with them, even for strength. When I go on holiday, that's typically what I bring, because it weighs next to nothing. I can put it basically in my back pocket if I want to, and I have my gym with me everywhere I go. So do strength training. That is a big key on not just for self-defense and martial arts, but also just for general health. If you're strong, just a lot of things, a lot of just processes in your body will function so much better. So train your strength and try to maintain it. The next phase, or the next category of things you should do, is injury prevention. Now, what does that mean? As we get older, we tend to accumulate smaller injuries, or little things here and there that are becoming more difficult. Arthritis is a big one, and so on. So what you want to do is try to avoid the injuries that are waiting to happen because of all those little or relatively big problems. There are ways to do that. So first is stability and coordination. I've explained this before, but very quickly, you've got movement muscles, the big muscles that move your body around, and then you've got stabilizers that make sure everything is coordinated, that you can keep your balance, and so on. These tend to be smaller muscles, and we usually take them for granted when we're young, but as you get older, it becomes increasingly important that you train those too. So training stability is something that is not all that difficult, but it takes specific practice. And if you are used to only training the big movement muscles, It's going to feel a little bit awkward because all of a sudden you are confronted with the fact that those stabilizers are not at all strong in comparison with the movement muscles, and that you have a really hard time doing some exercises that look so easy when somebody else does them, and that person actually did the training already and they have strong stabilizers. So work on stability and coordination means that your body works together. All the parts work together. And that brings me to the next aspect of injury prevention, and that is correcting erroneous movement patterns. Now, for that, you'll need help because it's very hard to correctly assess yourself when it comes to that front. So find a good physical therapist or somebody who's a really good personal trainer who has a bunch of experience with this kind of thing, and figure out what are the movement patterns that you have that are incorrect, again, due to a variety of personal issues that you might have. You might have one leg shorter than the other. You might have a little bit less flexibility on one side in a muscle than in the other, and so on. And we accumulate these things over the years, and they change the way we move our bodies. And that means that certain parts get used too much, and they get tired and exhausted, and other parts don't get used enough, and they become too weak. And that creates discrepancies inside our bodies, which as a result will make that certain movements become either difficult or impossible, or you can actually get injuries that way. So for that, again, I would advise you find a really good physical therapist and have them assess your movement patterns and see if there's something that needs fixing or that you can try to correct, or if you can't correct it, mitigate. And the last part of injury prevention I'll mention is flexibility. Again, as we get older, we become less flexible, and that means that coordination becomes different because the range of movement becomes smaller, which means that we use our bodies and muscles and so on differently, and that is then going to change those movement patterns that I just mentioned. So, do your stretching, do your flexibility exercises. You don't maybe have to try to go for splits anymore, but try to maintain all the minimum levels of flexibility in your joints and muscles, and even have a little bit of a surplus so that you have a little bit of a buffer should you do a high amplitude movement when you need to out of the blue. And this is just as important, for instance, for fall prevention, is when you slip as you're walking and you can't catch yourself. A, because you don't have the strength to suddenly contract the muscles you need, and B, because you've basically become too stiff, so your body doesn't move correctly anymore, and you can't put your foot, for instance, far enough for you to catch your weight. So everything is connected on that front, and flexibility can really assist in keeping you healthy and very strong and coordinated should you have to use your techniques, or if you just want to continue training martial arts. So there's so much flexibility advice available on the internet. I would refer to my stretching video that I did a while ago. And I also started doing in December some live training sessions on Facebook. We did 2 on hip flexibility, and I'm planning one on shoulder flexibility and mobility in the coming weeks. So I'll put links to that in the show notes as well, and you can check that out. But do maintain flexibility. It makes everything else so much easier. Right. So we're getting to the last part, and that is a little bit more the tactical part, if you will. So with that, I mean, let's talk techniques. As I mentioned before, you don't want to go 5 rounds with a young guy to do some sort of fight or whatever you want to call it. But it's not self-defense. What you want is to be done with it as quickly as possible if you can't avoid it. So with that in mind, if you're used to sparring in the ring or the octagon or doing some sort of competitive martial art, you really have to change your mindset if you haven't already. Because the physical part is so important in those kind of environments, and you won't be able to keep up. Ask the guys who are really in great shape in their late 60s and 70s, and just ask, how would you do against yourself if you would have to do 5 rounds against your 25-year-old self? how well would that go right now? And most people will be honest and say, I'd be exhausted after a few minutes. So you have to switch that mindset. And on a technical level, that needs to be evident as well. So what are some things I feel you have to work on? Setups, setting up your technique. So you don't have to be really fast, but instead you position yourself, your footwork, your stance, your hands, whatever you plan on using, you position yourself in such a way that you do a lot of work up front before you even launch into a technique. So that is one part. Another one is hitting vital targets. And with that, I mean effective targets. Just throwing a dozen punches in the general direction of your opponent, that can work if you've got energy and strength to spare, but that is no longer an option. So you have to make every technique you do count. And to get to that point, you need to target specific things on the anatomy of your opponent or your attacker so you can maximize those results. Doesn't necessarily have to be lethal targets, but it has to be targets that get as much as possible, an instant result. So he doesn't get a shot at you because he's immediately in debilitating pain, or he's immediately unable to see for the next minute and a half. So that's the kind of targets you go for. Next, speed. Focus on speed, not at the expense of power, but try to add speed and power together at the same time. No big wind-ups, no just looking at the end speed, but try to be as explosive as you can while still maintaining power. So that means a lot of speed, because this is one of the things that you can actually keep for a relatively long time if you work at it. You don't have to work constantly at speed, but definitely do it regularly. Now, I mentioned vital targets, and hand in hand with that goes precision. So it's not just knowing where to hit, it's also being able to hit it precisely, at speed with strength. So when you practice your targeting, make sure that you focus on relatively small targets and build in a little bit of a buffer should you miss or not completely be on target. So try to hit the smallest targets possible and be as precise as you possibly can. You should have done that anyway when you were younger, but now it becomes even more important. Now, the last component of setups that I want, and this is general advice as well, but this is the last one I want to mention here, and that is commitment. You've lived a long life at that point. You should have, at the very least, have some experience. And combined with everything else that I said before, you should know that you do not want to end up fighting 5 rounds with this guy. So you need to end it right away. So your commitment needs to be extremely strong. Call it your commitment, your mindset, your fighting spirit. I don't care how you call it, but that is a key point. Because you've got a lot to lose. You've got, again, we're all becoming more fragile. So you cannot take the kind of punishment that you used to when you're younger. And if you can take it, well, maybe you can survive it. But again, that risk of getting crippled or seriously injured permanently, that risk is pretty high. So your commitment needs to be that this ends right now, and then I have to get home and be at peace and be safe and sound. That means that either you go or you don't go with your technique, but you don't hesitate or do it half-heartedly. Now, again, this is advice that applies to everybody, but especially as you get older, either work your ass off to avoid a situation and get out of there. But if you don't have any other choice, you really have to commit to it, because a half-hearted technique that your attacker or the person in front of you can just ignore, the retaliation is something that you might not be able to survive. And that brings me to the last point, and this is a little bit controversial, but I think it is a valid point. Consider weapons. Now, weapons are equalizers in the sense that if you use them correctly, they will mitigate many of the factors that work against you, that mainly that you don't have the strength and the power that you used to. And in that regard, they can be very, very, very effective. The main point with that is, A, You have to check your legal status when it comes to that. I don't know where you are. I don't know where you live when you listen to this. So you have to check with your laws first to know that this is actually allowed or not. What is allowed to carry weapons and to use them, and how does that play out in the courts should you use them. Wherever you live in your country, there will be precedents as to people using weapons, and that includes elderly and aging people using weapons in self-defense. Try to find some of those cases and see what happened, so that you can consider this wisely and make good choices when it comes to either carrying and or using weapons to defend yourself. So that's the main thing. The second thing, as always, but especially as you get older, train with them. If you carry a weapon that you do not train with, then it is not necessarily going to be of much use to you, because if you don't train with it, don't expect it to work. This is true of everything. A weapon is not something that just magically gives you skill once you start carrying it. That doesn't work. It's a tool. Like any tool, you need to learn how to use it. So spend enough time practicing it. But I would say that just as much, spend a lot of time scenario training, even if only in your own mind, as to when would you use that weapon, what are the situations in which you would use it, and how would you use it, why, how would you access it, how would you hide the fact that you're accessing it, and how would you set up using that weapon, and so on. Do a lot of mental scenario training, going through all those different options that you can see, and then make sure that you check the legality of those options. Go talk to a lawyer that you know. If you know, even a retired police officer, talk to those guys and see, like, right, if right here, this is what happens and I do that, what would you guys do? What would the law say? And get a bunch of information that is realistic, that is just on the ground information, meaning people who actually, as their jobs, have to handle the aftermath of lethal self-defense or self-defense where weapons are concerned. Ask their opinion on whatever you want to do. Because just as it is bad to end up with permanent injuries because you get into some sort of fight over a stupid reason, it's equally bad to end the rest of your life in jail because you blatantly shot somebody and killed them because you thought you were in danger, but actually the law is not on your side. And I'll put a link to a post that I did on my Patreon not that long ago, showing exactly that scenario. Somebody using a firearm, thinking that they are allowed to defend themselves, but actually ending up in a really bad position because they were clearly wrong, despite them being convinced of that not being the case. And they had a lot of ideas, very strong ideas, about self-defense and using weapons for self-defense. And a lot of them were, to me, they sounded like a bunch of stuff that somebody has heard somebody else say or read on the internet on some forum or on social media, but nothing coming from solid instruction. So as always, be careful before you train something that when you use it, the end result is actually worse or just as bad as what you try to prevent. Right, that's it, Brian. I hope this is a good answer to your question. I tried to cover a lot of ground. So that's it. That's all I've got. And as I get older, I might have some more. But if you don't mind, I'll try to stay as young as I possibly can for as long as I possibly can. So it doesn't apply to me. And I'll see if they discover a Superman gene sometime soon, and I will have some DNA sequencing done and never age again. All kidding aside, I hope this helps, Brian, and anybody else. If you're listening to this, I hope this helps you out, and that we can all stay safe and live a long and happy life. How about that? All right, guys, this is it. I am going to call it for this episode. Again, the show notes are at wimsblog.com/56, the number 56. I'll put all the links there. And if you want to help out, as always, you can share this episode. That really helps. Give me a review on iTunes if you're listening to it there. And if you want to do something more, you're more than welcome to join me on Patreon, or you can do a one-time donation. There's different ways you can do that. Go to wimsblog.com/donate and you'll find all those options there. All right, everybody. The first episode of the year is done. I hope we all get a much better year than 2020. And with this episode done, I think I've tried to do my part to start the positive vibe as opposed to that damn pandemic that we really want to get rid of. All right, guys, that's it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.